Hello, everybody. Welcome to the War Room Podcast, the war and conflict themed podcast where every episode we discuss a different topic from war and conflict. I am one of your hosts, Kyle. Join with me, as always, my co host, James, also known as my dad. Dad, how are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Good to hear. We have, I'm drinking my beer while we're doing this, by the way, because I'm a common man. So I just, if you hear me take a drink every once in a while, that's what it is. Um, But I'm actually super excited for the topic we have today. I love the topics that we get into where I feel like they're things that aren't covered,
Yeah.
or aren't covered as much, and this is kind of the, I think, antithesis of that, which is we're going to be looking at special forces that you might not have heard of from history. So there's a chance you might have heard like a story or two about these groups, and there was a lot of groups to go through. I should say we had a big list to choose from.
Yeah, it was
Excuse
a
me.
big list.
Yeah, I actually even switched mine like part of the way through just because I found one that I liked a little bit more. But there's a bunch of like valid forces in this list. We're gonna be focusing on two actual forces today, and then hopefully later on in the episode we're gonna talk about some jobs you might not have thought of that are still they're specialty forces, they're specialty units, but it's not like a particular unit per se. It's more of a concept. We'll see if we've got enough room.
Fit that stuff in.
Yeah, exactly. We'll see. But with that being said, before we do anything, I do want to just define our terms. So special forces is a I think it's a thing everyone knows and everyone's got an idea of it, especially recently with the kind of war movie franchise type deal that has launched recently. A lot of people know about the Navy SEALs and
Books and
yeah,
movies,
video
TV
games. Yeah,
shows, a video game. Yeah, there's any number of them.
yeah. So a lot of people know about like a lot of people know about the Navy SEALs. A lot of people know about Delta Force. A lot of people know about even like SAS, like the British Special
Yep.
Forces, like Spetsnaz and things like that. But we're going to be talking about special forces kind of more in its traditional sense. I should say there's a couple definitions of special forces. It was actually like the term special forces is actually relatively new. Funny enough, it was I think it was first used in like the 40s, but the concept isn't. So I pulled some definitions of special forces. We're gonna pull a little bit from all of them, I think. Um, my favorite one's actually from the Federation of American Scientists. We kind of already talked about this, you and me, Dad. But special operations is more what we're looking at than like special forces, just because special forces technically means like it's referring to the U.S. specifically. Special operations
Yes.
is more of a broad term.
Global term.
Exactly. So what we define as special operations are going to be small units that are focused on operational objectives. So they have like a mission, they've got a goal, and they're not like the majority of the forces actually. So these units are not the makeup of the entire military force itself. They also tend to receive specialized training, specialized equipment, or specialized something. So they are unique and separate from the forces for which they fight with. So like example you brought up is like we actually wouldn't necessarily consider the Spartans special operations when they're just fighting by themselves because all of them are the same and they have the same training and the same
Exactly.
give
Same
or take.
equipment, same training, same mission.
Yeah.
So the Spartan army as a whole isn't really a special operations. Now, however, if you take a detachment from of them and you put them in with, say, the Greek army, um, you then have a group of special skills, and you would use them as special operations.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of our idea is we're looking at these highly specialized, well-equipped units that are distinct from the forces of the
Around them.
around them. So we found some cool options. Like I said, I moved on a couple different ones, but I actually ended up landing on what I think is a pretty cool group called the Janissaries. Now, any last thoughts on the special operations definitions and stuff before we get into?
Well, you know, a lot of times in history, and currently we train people for what we want
Yeah.
from them. Um, but in the past, you would look for specific types of people,
Hmm.
and then you would bring them in to do those type of operations. You wouldn't
Hmm.
necessarily train them for that operation. You would find people that have a certain skill set, and you would grab all of them up, and then you would give them a small amount of training.
Hmm.
Uh, Now we grab people that meet a certain physical requirement,
Hmm.
a basic mental requirement, and then we give them all the knowledge and all the training and all the tools to be able to do that job.
Yeah.
And then once we do all that, we weed them out even further
Hmm.
uh, to a select few.
Yeah, that's a thing we'll touch on definitely with the Janissaries, which is like exclusivity, and
Exactly.
with the special operations unit is pretty important. It was this was a
Yes.
group I didn't cover because I wanted to stick more with antiquity. But originally we were talking about possibly doing the Gurkhas, which is the Nepalese special forces. They're really similar to the French Foreign Legion, actually. In a way,
Mm,
they're
yeah.
kind of mercenaries, but they actually don't fall under the Geneva Convention definition of mercenaries. Or sorry, they do, but they receive an exception. So for all intents and purposes, if you look at the Geneva Convention, they are mercenaries in the same way the French Foreign Legion is, but they're actually so integral to the British as well as the Indian military, the Nepalese military, that they actually kind of get a pass. Um, there's only ever allowed to be 200 Gurkha force or individuals in, I believe, the British unit at a time. So the only way that spot opens is when someone leaves, someone dies, or someone retires, or something like that. And then there's
Or someone gets injured to where they can no
exactly,
longer
yeah.
perform.
But there is thousands and thousands of applicants that go through that process to try to get into that unit. And
Yes.
of that, only a small fraction make it through, which is pretty similar to our current process with
Yes.
like the SEALs and um, Delta Force is a little different because you had talked about that, but
Mhm.
that's like a selection thing of existing forces. It's a little different,
Well,
but it's similar
and
process.
to be honest, all of them are being selected.
Hmm.
Don't everyone's always being selected
Hmm.
because of a skill
Yeah,
or an ability.
or
And so
potential, I
that's
should say.
really or potential.
Yeah.
Yeah. So honestly, that is the defining thing for a special
Mm.
operations unit of any kind is that they're being selected for a reason,
Hmm.
uh, to do something that not everyone is equipped to do or not everyone can do. Um, and so, I mean, that's probably in the most lamest of terms.
That
That's
makes
really
sense.
what it boils down to.
Yeah.
Is you're selecting specific types of people.
Yeah. But with that said, let's just hop into the actual units
Let's do
themselves.
it.
So I'm actually going to be talking about the Janissaries. So the Janissaries they were an elite group of soldiers that actually fought directly for the Sultan for the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire is really interesting in history because it's immensely important. It's like it lasted for 600 years. It lasted far longer than Rome did. Um, but it actually doesn't get talked about a lot in history, at least in the history classes I took. We usually don't talk about them until we get to World War One and World War One because they were one of the primary forces we fought against. Was the Ottoman Empire. And then they dissolved afterwards. Um, but
Which is odd because when I was in school, we all got taught about the Ottoman Empire, because of their their accomplishment of taking
mhm.
over most of Europe.
Yeah,
Uh, i- so when I was in school, we definitely
mhm.
talked about the Ottoman Empire. So I'm surprised
Yeah,
that.
We did
that
not.
that's changed because it's a very important part of world history. It's not
Yeah.
even like European history.
Mhm.
They had an impact on the globe.
Yeah.
Um, eh, no more, no less than the British Empire. Uh, honestly,
Yeah.
um, so yeah, that's surprising to me because the Ottomans have
Mhm.
a very important role in history
Yeah.
uh, on the global scale.
Yeah, Ginger in chat just posted. I didn't even hear about them at any point in class. Yeah, that was my experience,
Wow.
which is probably because so the Ottoman Empire is obviously it's a much larger area, but it is stems from Turkey, modern day Turkey. Um,
Yes.
Again, it was an empire at that time, so it was a lot larger than just Turkey, but that's where a lot of that is centralized from. Um, but Turkey's always been in this very interesting state where it is close enough to Europe to where we sometimes consider it part of Western culture, but it is far enough from Europe and close enough to the Middle East and brown enough that we
To
sometimes
be
don't
a Middle
consider
Eastern
it
culture.
exactly. And it's
Yeah,
also its culture does kind of sit in a middle ground between those two places. So
I
the
believe so.
yeah, so the Ottomans are also in that kind of weird state in that they technically fall into like Western culture kind of, but not really. I don't think it matters because I think the focus on Western culture is kind of stupid for
Yeah.
a bunch of reasons. But either way, that is the Ottoman Empire. If you haven't heard a lot about them, they were around from the 14th to the 19th century, so around like the 1300s to around like the 1900s, I believe, was their reign. And this Janissaries, this elite unit, was around for essentially the entirety of the Ottoman Empire, so 1800s to 1300s. Yeah, so end of World War One. That
Mm.
is when the Ottomans ended. So the way they started is the Ottomans had a standing army, but the Sultan wanted essentially his own elite force, not just to protect him, but also as his own force that he could send to other areas to kind of do his bidding without having to activate the entirety of the army at the time, the standing army at the time. Um,
Yeah, they acted as a police force. They acted as
mhm.
bodyguards. They acted as border patrol agents. That they acted as a strike force specific for the Sultan.
Yeah, they were front lines during conflict, and when they weren't in conflict, they essentially did whatever duties were asked of.
Hmm?
By they were
Tax
firefighters,
collecting.
a whole bunch of
Yeah,
stuff. They were
lots of
essentially the
stuff.
Sultan's private army. Um,
Hmm.
the way that they were formed was actually based off of this tax called Devshirimi, I think. Devshireme. I don't know how to pronounce it. That's my best guess.
Dev Shirme or
Devshireme.
Dev Shirm.
Blood tax
Um,
is the translation, or
blood
child
tax.
levy. Essentially, what it is the Ottomans engaged in a lot of slavery, a lot of slave trade, with areas that they took over from conquest, as well as areas that they had already taken over, and they essentially took taxes in the forms of slaves. So they would say, of the slaves you capture, X percentage has to go to the Ottoman Empire direct, and then you can keep. So kind of horrible, but it was essentially a way to be able to gain
Yeah.
slaves off of the work of uh, conquered areas and things like that, especially
And
after conflicts.
now that comes from the Quran itself.
Mm.
Okay, so I have a quote from the Quran.
Mm.
Now, keep in mind this is an English translation. So, um, so here's how it reads: Know that 1/5 of the spoils that you obtain belongs to Allah, to the messenger, to the near of kin, to the orphans and the needy and the wayfarer. This you must observe if you truly believe in Allah and in what we sent down on our servant on the day when the true was distinguished from the false. The day on which the two armies met in battle, Allah has power over all things. Based on this promise from the Quran, the first Ottoman rulers reserved 1/5 of the young prisoners of war for a system called divshirme, or blood tax. So, based off of their interpretation of the Quran, right, wrong, I don't know. I honestly don't know. It basically is stating that you get 1/5 of the spoils, period,
Yeah.
and that to include humans.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that would be 1/5 of the livestock, 1/5 of the gold, 1/5 of the food, 1/5 of the water, 1/5 of the humans.
Yeah, in a world where slavery exists, slaves are property, and apply to property. We also apply to.
Bingo, exactly. But I just wanted to kind of put, where did that thought come from? The blood
Yeah,
tax. It comes from the Quran. Um, so that's its inspiration,
yeah, and I should
so to
say
speak.
Ginger is right. Like that is the modern. I've heard this as well. That is the modern justification for there's a like a percentage of. I think it's right. I think it's 20% of your income is supposed to go to like charity or something. In a lot of Muslim communities and stuff. That's kind of where that logic. Which is the thing
Well,
with all
and
religion is it's all a matter of
I'd say
interpretation.
Christians tithe, it's
Yeah,
10% or something
tithes
like
and
that.
things like that. So
Yeah. So this is basically the spoils of war
hmm,
defined. Does that make sense?
yes, yeah, yeah,
So it's kind of important in one aspect, because what it does is it limits what you can do.
mhm,
So, for example, the Ottoman Empire, they expanded their territory. All right, they took over quite a bit of Europe.
yeah,
However, because of this type of a rule, it didn't allow for you to go through and take everything. So all these places that you conquered were still had enough left to thrive, and you not just survive but thrive,
yeah,
versus other invading forces that would just take everything that was valuable
hmm,
and leave you with nothing. When you take everything from someone, they have a tendency to want to get it back.
yeah,
When you take a little bit from someone, they tend to justify it. Well, they didn't take everything. They could have taken everything and they didn't. So it's actually politically, it's not a bad uh, it's not necessarily a bad thing to not destroy the economies
yeah,
and take all the food, all the all the livestock.
yeah, yeah.
It
It's like
helps
the
with the rebellion factor.
yeah. It's also like at the end of the day, like these areas, you can kind of think of them as investments. For they're trying to essentially make things out of it. In this case, it's not necessarily income per se. It's food, resources, whatever it is. But we can think of it as
Yeah,
wealth. We can just think of it generally as wealth. The
correct.
British did the same thing. The Romans did the same thing. It is far better to keep people in a place where they're making you a smaller percentage of money over a long period of time, instead of just taking all of the resources and get a large short-term game that doesn't expand out, especially when it comes to holding empire.
Well, especially when it comes to resources that are have to be renewed.
Mhm.
So you could take all of the gold from somebody. If that's all the gold they have, they're never going to get any more, right?
Yeah.
However, if you take all of the livestock, you'll never be able to go back.
Mhm.
Those yeah, so
Yeah.
foods, things like that, they all have to be refreshed and renewed.
Mhm.
So you want those people in place to be able to do that, and you take a small percentage from
Yeah.
all of them, um, so that you can get some next year.
Yeah. Um, exactly. Now for the Janissaries, I should say that the slaves they took were very specifically children. So they took Christian
Correct.
children at the beginning. A lot from Balkan states. Now that this practice would evolve as time would go on, and they would take from other areas. But at this point, it was primary, or through the majority of the Janissaries' time, it was Christian children that were taken. They were then put into Muslim households and families. They were trained in how to speak Turkish. They were trained in the culture. They were trained in Islam to understand the religion and culture as well. And then they were put into what is essentially a training school, for setting their standard for working as the Sultan's personal army. Discipline was a really big thing for the Jews. So they couldn't have beards. They could have mustaches, so you'll see them with big mustaches, but they couldn't have beards. They could not take wives or have sex prior to their. They could after they left the Janissaries, after they served their time. But while they were serving as a soldier, they were unable to do those things at the beginning.
They were celibate.
Yeah, they were celibate at the beginning. They were not allowed to
Correct.
take on any profession other than soldiering.
Correct.
Now, again, we already talked about this. During peacetime, they would take on things like policing, tax collection, firefighting. That is all
But
kind
those
of
were roles,
yeah. Also, like the
not
real
careers.
the real thing is that you can't take anything that or you can't take on any trade that is not what the Sultan wants.
Correct.
If the Sultan
you weren't going to be a
decides,
carpenter. You
yeah.
weren't going to be an engineer. You weren't going to be a mason.
Well,
You know,
so
you weren't going to be a doctor.
well, you could be a
You
combat
know,
engineer, but you couldn't be like just a
exactly. Oh, it
Um,
had to be within the confines of the Janissary and what their
yes.
role was.
Um,
Period.
yeah, and this was a really selective process as well. Like they would kick people out. They would move people through a pretty long training process to eventually get to the point where they had this extremely disciplined, extremely well taught. There was a lot of like just educational things that they went through as well. Extremely well taught, extremely disciplined, and extremely loyal group of people. They were actually paid a wage as well, which is the Ottomans did that for various slaves, but they actually got paid a pretty decent wage. That would go up pretty significantly as their time would go on. But
I was going to say, they every time there was a new sultan, they demanded a wage increase.
yeah, I'll get to that in a second.
Oh,
But,
okay.
yeah, because that leads to another interesting story. But that is the kind of concept of what brought them to this level, and they were extremely effective as a fighting force during this time. They were considered some of the best archers in the entire Ottoman Empire. They were very good at it. Once firearms were introduced, they were one of the first groups in Europe actually to effectively take on muskets. Actually, I think they were the first organized army in Europe. Period. Because at this time the Ottomans hadn't developed like the standing army they had wasn't quite the way we normally think about it. This was the first official organized military with its own like ranking and structure, kind of as we normally think of it in Europe at the time. Um,
Yeah, everyone else had essentially serfs and vassals and things like that.
exactly.
Still,
Yeah.
uh, everybody had their own little military force, and then when you went to battle
Mhm.
or war, you grabbed everybody's little military force and brought it to bear.
Exactly.
This is different. This is a professional army, and I want to say real quick though, the Janissaries came from Christian boys,
Mhm.
all right, but they did not become Janissaries until the age of 24, 25.
Yeah.
So they stayed in an orta,
Mhm.
okay, which is between 200 and 400 men, and one of the ortas was actually the Ajami, which is basically translates to recruits.
Mhm.
So until the age of 24, 25, they could not even be an actual janissary, because during that course, that from boyhood to adolescence
Yeah.
to you know young adulthood, they still didn't make the cut. And it's funny that they picked the age of 24 to 25, because at 18 we think of a person as an adult.
Mhm.
However, males are still growing. And believe it or not, 18-year-olds are actually somewhat weak in comparison to somebody that has got another 5 or 6 years on them.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a reason that
Just
in the league, like the peak age of people tends to be 24 to like 29, that somewhere in that time span.
E- exactly. You've gotten about as strong as you're going to be at that point, and you're not haven't started tapering off yet
Yeah.
from age and abuse.
Yeah.
Okay, so now these individuals were highly they were well treated.
Hmm.
They I because we would keep saying the term slave, but I don't want to make that as like I don't want people to think that that these folks are in chains being
Hmm.
whipped. And now they were being disciplined heavily and hard.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, all military forces, when you train people, you discipline them very, very hard. However, um, a lot of these folks are literally getting ready to go into a very lucrative position,
Yeah.
and they know it. They
Yeah.
know what they have to look forward to if they're successful, and
Hmm.
that helps to drive a lot of them to be able to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
As the
Now,
oh, go ahead.
the other thing, real quick, since we were talking about these ortas,
Hmm.
um, basically, we one of our definitions was is a small force. Okay, and the Janissaries were not a small force.
Well, compared to the
They
Ottoman
were
army, they were a fraction of the total army.
right, but what I mean is that I want people to kind of understand that this was a force of no less than probably 50,000.
Yeah.
Uh, so, and that is including the recruits, by
Hmm.
the way. So, those are the ones that are being trained. So you literally have roughly 50,000. That's a pretty big contingent.
Yeah.
In today's standard, that's a lot of people.
Hmm.
However, during this time frame, it was not unheard of for armies to be 200 and 300,000. So it's while it is a small force by comparison to 350, 500,000, by today's comparison, by what we
Hmm.
do with so much smaller amount
Yeah.
of people, we wage war with far fewer people today than
True.
we ever did in history.
Mm.
So right now, a small force of 500, elite 500, they can do a lot.
Yeah.
Back then, it took 50,000.
That's true. Yeah. And they were spread around a lot of the. I mean, this is a massive. The Ottoman Empire is a massive empire.
Huge.
So they're
Exactly.
spread. They're spread all around. They've got different factions as well. As to like their, we kind of already talked about it, but like their credentials for being a special force. Like even just aside from the discipline, they got extremely good equipment. When they finally integrated muskets into their system, they got they had fully dedicated units just to supply them with ammunition, because they were so
Hmm.
effective with actually using firearms, as well as like early grenades and bombs and things like that. When they went through their school, they weren't just taught how to in combat. They were also within their own special operations. They were further put into even more special operations, and that some would learn how to
Hmm.
be engineers, like
Yes.
essentially sappers. So they would destroying
Yes.
structures and things like that. Some would learn how to tunnel, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But tunnel and get into um,
Breach.
fortifications, yeah, breaching, things like that. They had musicians. They taught musicians and artisans. Music was actually super important to their one. There was a very communal thing. It was like a very close knit brotherhood. Was the idea of when they originally made it, but their music was super important during conflict as well as outside of conflict, and the
They're
contributions they had there.
accredited with the first military bands.
Yeah.
So while other people might have used trumpets and things to signal,
Hmm.
the Janissaries were actually using bands to play music in the battle.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um,
Now, the Romans used drums for cadence.
yeah.
Uh, the French used drums for cadence. The English used the Americans used drums for cadence, but that's not music.
Yeah.
That's
That's
tempo.
different. Yeah.
They actually were making music, and um, one of the things that I read was that it inspired the morale
Mhm.
of the Janissaries. Now, the Janissaries kick people's butts all over Europe. Okay, they were very good at warfare. They were very good at what they did. Um, so they were definitely elite.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, they
and,
were.
and, and
I think they were there's arguments that they were the first group to actually use volley fire, which is the what would be adopted for all standing militaries using firearms for the next couple hundred years. Which is
yeah, any that are good use it.
yeah, the idea for anyone that doesn't know, the idea of volley fire is instead of especially early firearms, the problem with them is how extremely inaccurate they were. So the idea behind it is instead of having just one person fire, you would actually have a row of people. You've probably seen this in movies and things. All stand in a line and fire at the same time in a very close knit area. Essentially, trying to accommodate for that inaccuracy by getting everyone to shoot at a single area and then hope that one of those bullets makes it in. But
Yeah,
it's it's
it's a
it's
football field size shotgun blast.
Exactly, yeah. But for the weaponry at a time, that is a game changer. That is essentially what took. That is one of the things that made firearms better than crossbows and uh, archery at the time. Because remember, like crossbows and bows have far more kinetic energy than a bullet does. They are
Yes,
extremely deadly and extremely
yes,
precise as well. So the only thing that can, or the things that started to undo those as the king of ranged weaponry is speed, as you can load faster, as well as efficiency and things like that. And they are some of the they're on some of the forefront in Europe for developing these techniques for firearms. Um,
Now, I want people to understand that we still use volley fire today
hmm,
actively in the military,
mhm.
and we don't call it that. We have a slang term for it, and we call it a mad minute.
Oh,
And essentially, what happens is at the beginning of an engagement, um, you lay down a massive volume of fire. Everybody is shooting. And what you're trying to do is gain what's called fire superiority. So if I have more bullets going towards you than you have going towards me, you're going to have to duck. You're going to have to hide.
ah,
Now, you can't do that for very long because you run out of ammunition
yeah.
very quickly. All right, especially when you're using machine guns, fully automatics, uh, things like that. So what we generally do is we have that mad minute. Okay. And once we gain fire superiority, then we go to team fires, where essentially someone starts controlling who's shooting.
Mm,
And so what'll happen is team A will have a small volley, okay?
mhm,
And then they'll stop. And then team B will shoot.
mhm.
And then and so on and so forth.
Okay,
Okay.
I didn't know
Um
that actually. That's
it,
interesting.
it's something we train.
Yeah.
Now, to be frank, that works very well against certain situations.
Hmm.
However, in others, every individual will then the other type is we do sectors of fire.
Hmm.
So it basically, if I can get my, it's like something like this. All right. And the gunner is here and he has a left limit and a right limit and he's to kill anything in that. And then
Okay.
there's somebody right next to him that's got another V and they interlock.
Hmm.
All right. So anybody that gets in my zone of fire is mine.
Interesting.
Um, and so there's a couple, like I say, there's a couple different ways to do it, but you always want to gain fire superiority, always.
Hmm.
And that volley fire was kind of the basis for gaining fire superiority over
That's
someone
cool.
else.
Yeah. No, I didn't know that volley fire was still. By the way,
Mhm.
Swarley316, thank you for the follow. Um, Appreciate you, buddy. Love you. Uh, thanks for tuning in. Yeah, I don't want to get too off topic. But
Yep.
yeah, the Janissaries, they're this. I think we've fairly established. They are an elite force. They're an extremely disciplined unit. Now, what happened to them, which I think is almost as interesting as their development, because it's kind of a tale of, especially that getting away from what makes you successful without changing anything can be your downfall, which is essentially what happened with the Janissaries. So we talked about this, but this is a unit that was paid. So they were slaves. They were taken as slaves originally. But once they became Janissaries, they were paid, and they were paid pretty handsomely, actually.
Yes.
Another interesting thing that started to develop is that the Janissaries actually essentially became their own class in society. So
Mhm.
a lot of Janissaries that were, when their service was done, or when they weren't able to fight anymore, they would join the Sultan's palace, because they were extremely well trained and they were extremely well learned as well in both the
They were well
Quran and
educated.
Islam. Yeah, in a bunch of different things. Remember, some of these were
Mhm.
combat engineers. They were artisans and musicians. They were they understood warfare and conflict, so they were extremely important to the palace.
Economics.
Exactly. Um, and that actually led, again, we're talking about the course of, we're talking about 1300, or like 1360 to like 1890. We're talking about an extremely long span of time. So by the 1600s, the Janissaries had developed this really unique hold on political power. So they actually had
Yeah.
a huge amount of people in the palace court, um, as well as at this point they actually had a lot of leverage against the Sultan, because they were so highly sought after as one, not even as an actual unit of combat fighters, but also in the palace itself. They held so much political capital, that it actually became very important for the Sultan to make the Janissaries happy. That's actually where we start to see wage increases. So you talked about this earlier,
Yep.
but it became a precedent that the sultans would actually increase the pay when they became sultans a little bit, essentially like a bonus to each of the Janissaries, kind of like a nod. Hey, I appreciate you. Don't do a coup,
Yes.
until we get to, and this is an unfortunate story because it's a 14-year-old kid rises to sultan. um, I believe his name was uh, Osman, I believe, or Osman. He, I don't remember. It might have been I Ibrahim or Osman. I don't remember. But either way, the Sultan rose to power. 14-year-old kid. He says, he says, I think we need to redo our military. Like, it's the 1600s at this point. It's been 300 years. The Janissaries, remember, they're based in tradition, history, and discipline, meaning that they're not changing their policies that much. They'll adopt new weapons when they come in, but as far as like, they're
Mhm.
pretty stuck in their ways when it comes to the actual warfare itself and their policies. Yeah. So this kid decides we're going to reform the military. It's too bloated. He actually lost an engagement because of the Janissaries. Essentially, at this point, the Janissaries had become a little arrogant, and they actually, a lot of the things that kept them disciplined had been removed by favor. So at this point, the Janissaries could wed and father children prior to their retirement. The Janissaries eventually could have their own children serve. It wasn't just from the blood tax.
Well,
Um,
they actually stopped taking children,
yeah,
uh,
that
and
happened a little bit
only
after, I think.
the the only way that you could become a janissary was to be the son of a janissary
Yeah. Well, so there is,
at a certain point.
yeah, there in there. Eventually, you could even like buy your way in, apparently, with like political capital. So the standards had diminished greatly, but they still held a huge amount of political power, and they were still somewhat effective in certain battles. Um, but at this point, he had lost a conflict because of them. So he said, "You know what? Uh, Osman, Osman the second. It looks like. Thank you, Jin. Uh, so at this point, he goes to Mecca. He's looking for a new army in Egypt. and he comes back, and the Janissaries have started a rebellion, and take him, hold him for 10 days, and then kill him. Um, he actually cut their pay in half because he was wanting to punish them for their actions. Uh, that set a precedent that they could actually essentially kill and appoint whoever they wanted to sultan, if that was
Yes.
what was required. Actually, after this coup, they did a couple more. After this, this
Yes.
wasn't the only sultan they deposed and then killed. They
Yeah,
did
they
it
they
multiple times.
they started throwing what I like to call military temper tantrums.
Hmm.
And what that basically entails is when large units of soldiers become discontent or uh, are no longer willing to operate under the current regime,
Hmm.
they rebel and they throw these kind of temper tantrums.
Yeah.
And one of the things the Janissaries did was they went and literally burnt down parts of cities,
Hmm.
whole blocks of cities. They just burn it down.
Yeah.
This was this got them what they wanted temporarily,
Yeah.
but they made a lot of enemies doing these things. Now they were so full of themselves that they just assumed that they could do any of these things and get away with it
Yep.
forever.
Yeah.
But that ended up not being the
Yeah.
case.
Yeah. They did this a couple times. Actually, the Serbia, a offshoot of the Janissaries actually ended up taking over Serbia at one point. The first Serbian revolution is against the Janissaries. If you've ever heard of that, that's in like the 1800s. Um, but this goes on for a while, and eventually we get to Sultan Muhammad II, who finally realized this is not going to work. This group has far too much control. At this point, like this is in, I believe, the 1800s. So they go like, the Janissaries haven't evolved much at this point either. They're still fighting a lot like they did in the past. They haven't grown with conflict as time goes on because they don't think they need to. They feel, uh, I mean, they can destroy any sultan they want. They can take over countries. Don't have to abide by any rules. So Muhammad II declares war on them. Actually, um, blows up their barracks essentially, and finds any Janissaries he can, and either A, executes them, or B, exiles them. And that is effectively the end to the Janissaries. Now, they were replaced by other forces um, to fulfill different roles that were a lot up, or that were updated and based on the current time. Again, this is in the
Mhm.
1800s when this happens. So actually, I think it's like the 1830s or 1860s. So we're not that far off from World War One, which is the end of the Ottoman Empire. So the
Well,
Janissaries essentially last a huge chunk of this empire through just
oh yeah,
a large portion. I mean, about halfway through is when a lot of these changes started happening, where they were allowed increased pay and the discipline things went away. The training time went down. The age of the applicants went up. Like essentially, like things that were done for both A, efficiency, and B, at the request and behest of the Janissaries, are actually the things that ended up kind of being their downfall at the end. Now, had they changed, had they adapted as times went on, it might not have been as big of a deal. With these changes, might not have been the end of them. But because they wanted to operate as they did in the 1400s, when they were in the 1800s, that is kind of what led to this. Along
yeah.
with just the delusion of like fortune and fame and things like that.
Well, I'd like to say real quick that the Janissaries were only allowed to carry clubs. That's it.
Mm.
The
In
only
in
time they were
cities.
allowed the only time they were allowed to carry weapons were
Hmm.
if they were actually in an engagement, if they were on the front, if they were out on the border
Yeah.
as border guards. They were then allowed to carry weapons. But however, any other time they were only allowed to carry clubs.
Hmm.
So when the final sultan said, "That's it, you're done," these Janissaries were they literally took artillery, set it up around their barracks
Mm-hmm.
and leveled the barracks,
Yeah.
lit the barracks on fire. So those that survived the inferno and escaped were actually hung by mobs of people
Mm.
because the people had been abused by these soldiers for a long period of time. And that's what I was getting at, is that you have to be careful in how you do things. And if you wield too heavy a hand against a population, the moment you become weak enough, they will exact some form of retribution upon you.
Yeah.
And so those that weren't burnt uh, or blown up were hung by mobs of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so it should be a lesson
Mm-hmm.
that people, future history, historians should teach it, and leaders should learn from it.
Yeah.
uh, because this narrative it repeats throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
And the one cool thing about the Janissaries is that when you look at the Janissaries, they remind me a lot of, say, the Templars.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they were selected.
Mm-hmm.
They were well educated, rose to power, gained wealth,
Mm-hmm.
fame, land holdings, made the wrong ruler angry, and quite literally got wiped out
Yeah.
physically. I mean, it wasn't like, okay, you guys just go home.
Yeah.
No, they literally tried to wipe them from the planet.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it
A
it
contingent.
see there's a lot of similarities there.
Yeah. Yeah. A contingent of Janissaries would survive in say, Serbia. We kind of already talked about that. But they, with their own brutal oppression of the people, would be overthrown with the first Serbian revolution in
Mm-hmm.
1800.
Yep.
That is the end of the Janissaries. Again, I think the Ottoman Empire is a really fascinating cornerstone of history that we really need to make sure we touch on, especially in his classes and stuff. I know Ginger is out there for sure. If it comes up, she will let people know. But
The
yeah.
real cool thing about the Ottomans is that the Ottomans were very, very, very well educated.
Hmm.
Education and knowledge was a very big thing.
Yeah.
While Europeans were still kind of dark age.
Yeah, yeah. We actually,
Uh,
me and Ginger were talking about this. It's very
the
interesting that we call the Dark Ages the Dark Ages, because the Dark Ages also corresponds to the Golden Age of Islam when we discovered like numbers and like zero and
oh
mathematics, and
yeah,
like
I mean,
other areas of the world are
medically,
doing insanely well.
exactly. Europe was like just slogging through the mud, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
hygiene. I mean, medical. Like literally, they were doing surgeries. They were doing brain surgeries
yeah,
in the Ottoman Empire. I mean, things that we think of as modern medical techniques. These guys were building way back then. So
yeah,
so they weren't a bunch of heathens and barbarians. They were very, very sophisticated, very intelligent. Um, so yeah, they're
yeah.
definitely somebody that people should observe and learn from.
Agreed.
I would say.
Agreed. But that's all I have on the Janissaries.
Cool.
This is our halfway mark, so I'm trying this now. If you haven't already, if you're listening to the podcast version of this, as it seems like quite a few people are, we're getting a decent amount of people listening. I've really enjoyed
Cool.
the amount of people that have really appreciate the amount of people that have been listening. But if you are listening to the podcast, please do give us a follow on whatever podcast service you're using. You can always catch us live as well at twitch.tv/the War Room Podcast, where usually every other Sunday we will do a episode. Just follow us there, and you will get a notification when we go live. If you want to go live, you can always check us out on YouTube as well. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe button, all that jazz. So that's our halfway mark. I'm gonna try doing that. I'm trying to do that at the halfway mark and at the end now.
Cool.
So I think
Smart.
that'll be good. So we appreciate you listening. Is my point. With that said, you have another unit to go over, right?
Yes. So the next unit that I'm going to cover is not the Spartans.
Thank God.
I
I love
know
the Spartans, but
everybody.
man, everyone covers the Spartans.
Yeah. No, it's actually called the Sacred Band of Thebes.
Mm.
Not thieves, like as in people that steal things, but Thebes is in
With a
the nation.
yeah, with a
Thebes.
B, with a B.
Yeah, with a B in it. The Sacred Band was an elite military unit from Thebes comprising of 150 gay couples. Okay. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, these 300 gay warriors led Theban army against the Spartan army. The Thebans won and shattered the Spartan control of Greece. Okay. So a lot of people look at the Spartans as an elite force
Mm-hmm.
of their tactics were refined, their training outstanding. The selection process to be in there to be a fighter for them was strict. Okay. These are elite warriors, period. Um, and they got it handed to them by 300. Okay. The reason that 300 is important is because there was a limit. There was only ever going to be 300. If someone died, someone retired, someone was injured and could no longer do it, one person would be selected to come in.
Mm-hmm.
If the partner decided they weren't going to fight anymore, all right, because the other one was injured or the other one had died, then a couple would be brought in. So why is this important? It's important because in Thebes at that time, they had a different view of um, the importance of of couples,
Mm-hmm.
whether they be same sex or different sex.
Mm-hmm.
So the Thebans believed that gay warriors fought better in order to impress and protect their lovers.
Mm-hmm.
If a lover fell during a battle, his partner would fight even harder to avenge his death. So a lot of people um, throughout history have I'm going to call it a propaganda because it kind of is. You know, come fight for us,
Mm-hmm.
defend your moms, your dads,
Yeah.
your brothers, your sisters, your wives, protect them,
Yeah.
right? And there is something to that,
Mm-hmm.
believe it or not, that can inspire people to fight for a certain amount of time. However, they took it a step farther and said, you'll fight harder
Mm-hmm.
if your children are in your foxhole.
Yeah.
You'll fight harder if your spouse your is is there with you. You'll fight harder to
Yeah.
protect them. And so they were at a minimum, they're the last gay army.
Mm-hmm.
All right, just so everybody knows. But they are not the last gays to serve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, and a lot of people have a view that somehow gays are effeminate, and and the truth of the matter is that while some are, not all are
Yeah.
at all. And so these were selected not just because they were gay.
Mm-hmm.
You had one, you had to be gay,
Yeah.
and you had to have a partner. But two, you had to be a superior athlete and a superior warrior. So it wasn't just okay. We're going to take any gay. No,
Yeah.
they had to be elite, absolutely elite. Okay, so they established the sacred band beginning in the 4th century BC. Um, the leader handpicked the members based off of their skill as a warrior, okay, as well as their athletic ability. They were full-time professionals, so they weren't like a a, a guard or a
Mm-hmm.
reserve or they wouldn't go home
Yeah.
and farm. They were full-time paid warriors. Um, the city state of Thebes would supply them with a cuirass, which is armor,
Yeah.
right? Helm, greaves, which covered your legs, and then a shield. And their primary weapons were a 4-meter long spear and a sword. So they were given all of these tools.
Mhm.
Now keep in mind that at this time, armor was a luxury. A sword, believe it or not, was a luxury. A lot of these forces were using clubs and farm implements in warfare
Yeah.
still.
Yeah, if it's
Um,
pointy.
Bingo,
Yeah.
right? So, to supply 300 people with excellent armor and weapons is a pretty profound thing back then. So it takes a lot to produce 300 swords,
Yeah.
period. Okay. Their training included wrestling and dance.
Okay.
In the battle, they served as shock troops, um, killing one of the things that they were tasked with was finding and killing enemy leaders.
Oh, okay.
So keep in mind that an enemy leader generally had his own elite bodyguard unit. So these guys would literally seek those folks out and destroy them so that they could kill that leader.
Real quick, do you mind defining shock trooper for anyone listening?
So shock troops are, I don't. This is my definition of a shock troop.
Mhm.
A shock troop is quite literally someone that is not really engaged in the battle at the moment.
Mhm.
Okay. And when you need, let's say you're starting to lose ground,
Mhm.
you send them in to bolster that unit and get a resurgence. They're also a lot of times sent to strategic points on the battlefield
Mhm.
to, for example, we just said that one of their tasks was to kill the enemy leaders.
Yeah.
Um, that causes mayhem on the other side. So you use them strategically in spots where
Gotcha.
where this small amount of people can have a huge effect on the entire
You're like
battlefield.
breaking enemy lines or pushing back enemy
Pushing,
advances and things.
break, hitting them and from their flanks
Mhm.
to sometimes they were used to break a line.
Gotcha.
So literally, they would come in so hard and so fast, um, and it's usually that there was some fatigue happening on a stretch of a battlefield. You've got
Yeah.
these different units set up. And let's say the left flank is starting to buckle a little bit, rather than getting into a protracted engagement over there,
Yeah.
because it's already probably been a while that they've already been fighting. If they're starting to wane, you would send them in to literally break that line, and it would shatter that line. Now, what happens in ancient history is if you lost part of the line, everyone was then vulnerable.
Yeah.
And so you would a lot of times get uh, the enemy to literally go into a full retreat.
Mhm.
So what that did is, one, it gave you ground, but two, you broke them. They retreated, and now you can police up your weapons. You can get your injured. You can rest. You can resupply. You can reorganize your troops
Mhm.
for a counterattack of sorts.
Gotcha.
So shock troops are very important in the sense that they do things that literally can affect the entire battlefild if it's
Mhm.
done correctly, and if they have the skill, the training, and the equipment to do so.
Gotcha.
Um, so the city state of Sparta was the winner of the Peloponnesian War, and after the war, they dominated the Greek world.
Yeah.
Um, Thebes challenged that supremacy and started the Theban Spartan War in 378 to 362 BC. Because of the brilliant military tactics of that sacred band, um, the Thebans were able to defeat the Spartans. So they didn't just do it once.
Yeah.
They did it on multiple occasions, protracted throughout that time period.
Mhm.
Um, so two major battles, two major battles happened with Sparta.
Mhm.
One was the Battle of Tigera and the Battle of Leuctra. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Um, in the Battle of Tigera in 375 BC, that was the first time that the Spartans lost despite having an army. Okay, so 300 warriors of the Sacred Band routed 1,800 Spartan soldiers. So this wasn't 300 on 300.
Yeah.
So you have the Spartans that are well equipped,
Mhm.
extremely well trained,
Yeah.
hardened warriors that are being routed by 300 to 1,800. That's a pretty big thing.
Yeah.
It does establish a level of eliteness
Yeah. Yeah.
right there. Um, at the Battle of Leuctra, and I might have said that wrong. That's 371 BC.
Okay.
Thebes fought with a force of 7,500 soldiers against 12,000 Spartans. Now, the 300 were a part of that 7,000.
Gotcha.
Excuse me, that 7,500.
Which I should say is how the Spartans fought as well during their conflicts as well. It wasn't like that when we think of the 300. It wasn't actually the 300. There was also like 1,000 or 2,000 Athenians. And there was a lot of other people
Correct.
that fought with them as well. It wasn't just the
Yeah.
single.
So at Thermopylae, the famous Battle of 300
Yeah.
at Thermopylae, there were only 300 Spartans. That's true. Um, but the 300 Spartans weren't the only force on the
Exactly.
cliff.
Yeah.
There were, I think, 2,000 more
Mhm.
people that were there. Um, now the Spartans held the line and allowed for um, a retreat of sorts
Yeah.
of forces. Um, but that wasn't the Spartan army. It was only 300,
Yeah. Yeah.
if that makes sense. It was 300 selected people that went. Um, but the Sacred Band was ever only 300, period. They were only ever going to be 300. Um, so the Sacred Band, so this is at Leuctra. The Sacred Band hacked through the elite units of the Spartan army. They killed 1,000 of their most experienced soldiers, including the Spartan king. After that, Sparta asked for a truce.
Mhm.
So these 300 went up against the elite, the most elite of the Spartans,
Yeah.
all right, to include the ones protecting the king,
Mhm.
and wiped all of them out.
Yeah.
They basically wiped out 1,000 of them by themselves.
Mhm.
And, so I, as far as a resume, I believe that in and of itself is a true testament to how elite
Yeah.
these folks were. Um, they met their end at the Battle of uh, Chaeronea
Mhm.
in 338 BC. So uh, Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great, people might have heard of him, invaded this central Greece and the Greek city states, led by Athens.
Mhm.
And Thebes fought back, but the Greek hoplites were no match against the Macedonian phalanx. At the end of the battle, the Greeks fled the battlefield. The Sacred Band continued to fight. Despite being surrounded and outnumbered, all 300 men died fighting for each other. Their leader, the Genis, he fell last. Yeah, come on, this is history, so who knows? But
Yeah. Yeah.
that's the story, okay? And, trying to protect the body of his dead lover, okay? Philip II actually cried when he saw the dead bodies of the elite warriors. He knew the Sacred Band very well. 30 years before that battle, Philip II was actually a hostage in Thebes During that time, he became the Romanus, which is beloved of Pelopidas. I don't know if I'm, yeah. Anyways,
Can you back
the
up just a little
commander.
bit, by the way, from the mic?
Say again.
You back up just
Oh,
a
I'm
little bit.
sorry.
You're good. Thanks.
So he became the beloved of Pelopidas,
Mm-hmm.
who was the commander of the Sacred Band.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the Sacred Band served as a model for the reformation of the Macedonian army. So, uh, they got wiped out by Philip, but Philip was very familiar with them because he was actually basically a beloved of their commander at one point as a hostage, and uh, they were so impressed by them on the battlefield that the Macedonian army literally reformed and remodeled itself on the principles of this 300. So that also is a testament to how elite they were at that time.
Yeah.
That you would take and go, you know what? We're going to adopt some of their fighting styles
Mm-hmm.
and some of the way that they maneuvered.
Yeah.
Now, um, I picked them for a couple of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons is that they stood toe to toe with another elite force and put it on them.
Yeah.
All right. But not only that, um, in the end, when all was said and done and they were annihilated,
Mm.
they someone else took what they were doing and reformed that for their entire army. Now, Alexander the Great went on to conquer Constantinople, and
Constantinople.
I mean,
Yeah, I think I've heard of
you
him.
know, he,
Um,
yeah. So, you know, he had a genius for military endeavors,
yeah.
and so the fact that they would adopt their tactics and things, that's a tenement as far as I'm concerned
Yeah.
too, and they were unique
Mm-hmm.
in history, I believe.
Yeah. No, I would agree. I think it also. I think you're right. There is, and to be fair, we have to remember that a lot of the ways we feel about LGBTQ are like rooted in like our society. So
And ignorance.
and well, ignorance for sure, yeah.
Yeah.
But like it's also not historic, is what I mean. So there is
Right.
historically, like a big one is trans rights right now, but historically that's not been an issue in some cultures, and in some cultures it is an issue. It's one of those things
Yes.
where um, I think it is. I think it's always helpful to see examples that disprove biases. And you're right. There is
Yes.
especially as someone in the LGBT community, there is a lot of there's a lot of like conceptions about masculinity and how that affects sexuality. And this is, I think, a
Yeah.
pretty decent proof that it doesn't actually matter. People are just different, and some are a little bit more masculine and some are not, and it doesn't actually matter, and it has no correlation to your masculinity or to your
Exactly.
sexuality or anything like that. If a big gay
Exactly.
army can defeat the Spartans, I think then that's a proof that that's not really a thing. Ginger, I really appreciate pointed out a good thing, which is if there are any service members currently, or actually anyone in the LGBTQ community that's struggling with anxiety or depression, please do contact the Trevor Project. It's great project. 1-866-488-7386. You can give them a call. They will help you through whatever you go through. That is I mean, we can maybe talk to this, but or you can maybe speak to this, but our own U.S. militaries, what's the word? relationship with LGBTQ community has always been very tumultuous, I guess is the right word. With don't ask,
I
don't
wouldn't
tell,
say
and
that.
well,
I wouldn't say that. I'd say that, and here's why I wouldn't say that is because, um, in a time of warfare, we we don't care about the color of your skin necessarily, and we don't care about who you're attracted to. So and there's a perfect examples of during the world wars, there was a large contingent of gay service members, huge contingents of them, and it wasn't even and there wasn't any rules of don't ask, don't tell, or any of
mhm,
those things. Now, I will say, and this is kind of disappointing, that upon completion of their service, or when they were no longer needed anymore,
mhm,
they were surreptitiously, I'm probably using that word, surreptitiously dismissed.
mhm,
So, now I don't know the validity of this, but I've heard it on several occasions in several different documentaries and things that the establishment of San Francisco's kind of gay community
mhm.
is actually paramountly responsible from the military. So what would tend to happen at the end of wars is that you would come home and they would give you like enough money for a bus ticket. Well, I believe San Francisco was one of the major ports. So people would come home from overseas
Mhm.
and they'd get dropped off in San Francisco because that's where, and then you were supposed to go home.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of them didn't want to go home.
Mhm.
And so, and I'm once again, I don't know this for a fact, but I've heard it on several different occasions that the basic start of that community, and it
Mhm.
is a community,
Yeah.
um, literally was primarily started because that was where the military dropped
Mhm.
a lot of them off
Yeah.
in one location,
Yeah.
and so they got uprooted from their home, taken to war, right? And then all brought back to one location.
Yeah, yeah. I think Ginger brings up a good point, which is I don't necessarily mean individually. I mean institutionally, and you brought up a point
Oh,
as well, which is that, um, and we actually talked about this in our when we were talking about we had read that the Confederacy statute of using slaves, like bringing enlisting slaves into the Civil War, which is that the
right.
military at its heart cares about completing a task, and they actually don't
Yes.
really give they don't really care too much about how that task gets done. The objective is, you've talked about this before, like the point is to get a task done. It doesn't matter whether you can or can't. That is your job. Um, and
Unfortunately, the politics happen afterwards,
Exactly. That's what
right?
I'm saying. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's easy at the time when it's convenient to accept these people, but as soon as it becomes inconvenient to do so, either politically or socially, that's when it tends to happen. And we do still
Yeah.
experience that a lot. And also, like at the end of
Yeah.
the day, especially when people aren't in conflict, people will bring their own prejudices as well.
Now, I will say that there were several years where it was a brutal thing
Mhm.
uh, to be different.
Yeah.
That's 100% true. Uh, um, and I would have to admit that um, e- early on, I would say that I probably believed maybe 50% of the dogma.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples. The AIDS was a big thing
Yeah.
when I was young. It was a very scary thing. And so one of the things was is that homosexuals just all had AIDS,
Yeah.
you know. Uh in a in a field where blood is spilled and you share blood, you bleed together.
Yeah.
That is a very scary thing.
Hmm.
All right. Period. So that fear
Yeah.
of a disease inspired people to behave really shitty.
Yeah.
And then I talked about ignorance earlier. I didn't know.
Mhm.
I only know what I'm told. I only know what I learn.
Yeah.
And so um, I was guilty of having that very small mind
Yeah.
at one time. Um, a- Another one was women in the
Mhm.
military.
Yeah.
I was told straight out when I was in the infantry, do not be involved with a military woman.
Hmm.
She is out to get you. She will destroy your career,
Yeah.
so on and so forth. And it was it, what's the easiest way to get people in line? Fear.
Hmm.
Fear that they're going to lose something or that they're going to somehow be in trouble or
Yeah.
in not in a trouble like a slap on the wrist, but like trouble like going to jail kind of trouble, right?
Yeah.
Now, when I transitioned from the infantry to aviation, my first aviation unit had the first female air cavalry troop commander. So the first female that I have to deal with in the military isn't a squad mate
Mhm.
or a platoon, or it's actually the commander.
Uh-huh.
I was terrified of this. this
Yeah.
I'm not lying. I was
Yeah.
terrified of this little teeny human. She had a booster seat for the helicopter. I'm not lying. She had a
Yeah.
booster seat for the helicopter. Anyways, um, she would come up and talk to me, and I wouldn't talk to her. I just wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And if she came in the room and I was alone in the room, I exited the room like it was on fire.
Yeah.
I would not get caught in a room alone with this person because I was so afraid that something was going to be misconstrued.
Yeah.
I was probably there for 3 or 4 weeks, and she literally cornered me and just was like, "What? You don't think a woman can do this job?" And blah 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 blah. And I was shaking, and she goes, "What is wrong with you?" And I was like, and I just flat told her, I was like, "Listen, it's got nothing to do with you. I'm still an infantryman, and this is what we're taught." And I think she was laughing so hard, I think she almost wet herself. Um, because it seems so odd to her, right?
Hmm.
That people would still think in those terms. And
Yeah.
she's like, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "No, it's nothing like that." So uh, after gaining some insight,
Yeah.
um, I changed my point of views on people and their value to something more. I like to call myself kind of a humanist.
Hmm.
I look at people as a human and not a gender or a color or even a religion. To be quite honest, I try to compartmentalize people into human,
Yeah.
and that helps me a little bit. Um, but everyone suffers from ignorance
Yeah.
at some point in their life, and you're much more progressive than I was at your age, but that's partly because your knowledge base is different than my knowledge base
Exactly.
was,
Yeah.
and the knowledge base of my father and his father. So a lot of people want to look down their nose at people because they don't necessarily believe the way they do. But sometimes it's not that it's not they know what they know, and that's all they know.
Yeah.
And so how you present the message, I
Hmm.
say, is very important. If you present the message to where somebody can accept it, and then I think you get a little bit better. Now, had she like done it differently,
Hmm.
my perspective may not have changed as much
Yeah.
um, in that aspect. But I will say that I served with men and women
Hmm.
of all colors, all nationalities, all religious backgrounds,
Hmm.
and all different kind of orientations.
Hmm.
Um, and the quality of them, uh, for me, always came back to the quality of them as a comrade,
Yeah.
okay, as a um, uh, as a tactician,
Hmm.
as somebody that actually has knowledge of the tactics and the skill to perform them.
Yeah.
Um, Beyond all the other things, because all the other things are very personal. Those are personal things that I don't really need to have an opinion on. I don't believe.
Yeah. I would agree.
And so I try to keep, to just say, look, focus on the professional guys
Yeah.
and ladies. Focus on the professional. Now, one of the things that I forgot to bring up about the Band of Thebes
Hmm.
is that we have a system in place, and you're familiar with this,
Hmm.
Kyle, and and we call it the buddy system.
Yeah.
Most military forces around the globe have what's called a buddy system. And that is where you have somebody that is assigned to you as your buddy. And when you go to the bathroom, they guard you when you're going pee. And when they are going pee, you guard them. They guard you when you shower. They guard you when you sleep. They go places with you and assist you with all manner of different tasks.
Yeah.
All right. The Band of Thebes was the ultimate buddy system,
Yeah. Yeah.
quite
That's
literally.
true. Yeah.
So it's not that unique
Hmm.
of a concept
Yeah.
that having a buddy, having someone that you can have as a confidant,
Hmm.
somebody that you can count on, somebody that you work with regularly, day to day, every day, you learn the ins and outs of this person.
Yeah.
Um, it is important to a cohesive unit.
Hmm.
It's it So they took that concept a step further,
Hmm.
okay, and made them couples. But in some cases, a lot of people, when you get to really, when you have a battle buddy and you're in combat, you get to know that person pretty well.
Yeah.
Um, and you create a bond uh, how do I say it? It's not on a sexual level, okay? But you create a bond for life with these people.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have a shared experience that is profound,
And unique
that other
to you.
people, yeah, and
Yeah.
that other people, while they can um, understand it,
Hmm.
they can't really relate to it.
Yeah. They can sympathize, but they might not be able.
And so there is a bond to combat that is unique. Um, uh, Firefighters will have that type of bond.
Yeah.
Police officers will have that type of bond because it's a unique thing.
Hmm.
And so I just wanted to kind of close, the Thebes
Yeah.
stuff with that. They were the ultimate battle buddies,
Yeah. That's an interesting point,
and
actually.
and I respect the fact that uh, they not only were willing to try something along those lines, but that it was
Hmm.
so successful.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that we need to look at things and look at the success of something for what it is.
Hmm.
The eh,
I agree.
if you discount people because they're different, you pass up an opportunity to possibly get some of the most amazing effective people.
Hmm.
That would be the cautionary tale I would say to any future military uh, folks is,
Yeah.
be careful who you disclude, uh, because they are different. They may be the absolute best thing to
Yeah.
ever happen. They may be the person that if you'd had them on the battlefield meant that 50% came back or 70% or
Yeah.
80%. And that's a big thing.
Yeah.
So,
I agree.
all right.
Yeah. Actually, we're I think we're getting long on time. Actually, we'll probably,
All right,
if we're
perfect.
good with those other topics. Yeah, I think those are all great statements. Based on what we just talked about, I think the only thing I would say is I would encourage everyone to recognize the fact that it's okay to be a little racist and a little sexist and a little homophobic. Like these things happen, and it's based on these are things you learn, and you don't know they're wrong until you know they're wrong. Um, but if you once you do know they're wrong, then you know they're wrong, and then it's time to change. So do research. That's what I tell people. Just do like a little bit of research. All you have to do. That is the enemy of ignorance. Is just information and knowledge.
Yeah.
Just look it up.
Knowledge.
Whatever. Usually, if it's a thing that's wrong, there's somewhere where someone is lining out mathematically and historically why that's incorrect. I think it's the
honestly,
most powerful thing you can do.
I would encourage people, if you're going to look something up, don't look for it under your source.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, you know what your point of view is. And if you go to somebody that shares your point of view, then you didn't learn anything.
Yeah.
Honestly,
Yeah.
I challenge people to look at a source that doesn't have your viewpoint.
Yeah. Listen.
You may at the end of that, you may decide that you have the right viewpoint, but at least you gave it
exactly. No, 100%.
Some consideration.
100%.
But in the end, your view, you may say, you know what, I'm still sticking to my viewpoint, but I'm altering it just a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's
yeah. No,
I think that's important.
I agree.
I think it's important.
Yeah. Ginger says go to Fox News. Yeah. I like, that's why I don't mind listening to, like, not in this particular, but like people that are bigots, because I'm not concerned. Like, I'm fine listening to that because that's not gonna, if it doesn't change me afterwards, I know that, and I actually listen to it, then I know it's not valid. There's no harm in it. No, I think it's a good lesson going forward. But with that, that's actually I think where we're going to end. Any other thoughts on the Janissaries or Sacred Band of Thebes?
All I would say is that if you find this to be interesting, there were a lot of different ones to choose from. There really were. There's a lot of unique units out there that have done some amazing things. If you have one that you know of that you think is really impressive, send it to Kyle, because he does all this stuff, and make a suggestion. If if you have an idea, send it out to us, and we'll look into it, and maybe we'll do it, because I fell upon the one I had kind of on accident, believe it or not, and I loved it. The moment I read it, I was like, man, these guys are awesome. I've got to talk about them.
Yeah.
So
yeah, if you do have any ideas, you can always email us at thewarchat@gmail.com. We also have a Twitter and Facebook, the War Chat, where you can direct message us. We also always post these full live videos on YouTube. Feel free to leave a comment there. I think you can't really leave comments on the podcast itself, but there's plenty of ways to get in contact with us through those methods. Again, please do follow us on whatever podcast service that you're currently listening to. We really appreciate you listening to us, and we really appreciate all the listens we've gotten over these last couple episodes. We're gonna keep doing it. If you know anyone who you think would like this, please let them know. We're trying to grow as big as humanly possible, so we have a bunch of things we want to do and a bunch of different projects we'd love to work on. And I think that would it lets us know that we're heading in the right direction. So we really appreciate anything you can do there.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about the next one.
Yeah,
already.
Yeah, actually,
I'm excited about the next one.
Yeah, so we've got some ideas coming up. We think the next episode is probably going to be Badass Women in History for Women's History Month, which I think is going to be super sick to talk about. There's a bunch of different lists. I don't want to spoil it. You're gonna have to tune in for that one. But with that being said, again, we really appreciate you listening. Any last words, Dad, before we close?
No, thank you everybody for coming out and listening to us, and thank you, Kyle, for editing and posting and doing everything.
Of course, that is here for. And I think I already said it earlier, but just as a reminder, if you're listening to the podcast version of this and you do want to catch us live, we are live on Twitch. All you have to do is go to twitch.tv War Room Podcast, or just look up War Room Podcast on Twitch. If we're not live when you look at us, you can follow us there. You'll actually get a notification when we go live next. So you can participate. We have a chat room where you can ask questions, you can engage with us, things like that. So if that's something that interests you. You
Stay
can
safe.
get us there. Yeah.
Wear a mask.
Please stay safe. Wear a mask. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Bye.